Production and distribution of City Club Forums on IdeaStream is made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Ann Goodman, President and CEO of the St. Luke's Foundation. I'm really pleased today to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kathryn Edin, Bloomberg Distinguished Professor in Sociology and Public Health at Johns Hopkins University, and author of $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America. According to the United States Census Bureau, in 2014, there were 46.7 million people, 14% of the U.S. population, living in poverty. Within this 14%, approximately 1.5 million households, including 3 million children, live in what can be considered extreme poverty, existing on just $2 per person per day without substantial government assistance. These individuals resort to selling plasma, selling their food stamps, and sometimes even selling sex to secure the necessary cash to make ends meet. This is our penultimate forum of the Resilient Family Series, which we are proud to sponsor in partnership with the William J. and Dorothy K. O'Neill Foundation and Goodwill Industries of Greater Cleveland and East Central Ohio. It began almost a year ago with Marian Wright Edelman discussing childhood poverty. Our goal with this series was to elevate the awareness of issues that families face, their strengths, as well as their struggles. Dr. Edin is here today to discuss her most recent book, $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America. By the way, that's not an exaggeration or a metaphor. That's fact. There are people who are our neighbors who are living on $2 a day. We might need to sit with this for a second. Dr. Edin is a sociologist who studies poverty by deploying ethnographic observations, in-depth interviews, and mixed method approaches to the demands of welfare and low-wage work, family life, and neighborhood contexts. The author of 6 books and more than 50 journal articles, Dr. Edin's research has had a profound impact on those in the poverty research community, convincing them that deep insight into the lives of the poor requires both surveys and systemic qualitative explorations. She earned her Ph.D. in sociology from Rutgers University in 1991, and in addition to Rutgers, has taught at Northwestern University, the University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard University. Dr. Edin is a trustee of the Russell Sage Foundation and a member of the Department of Health and Human Services Advisory Committee for the Poverty Research Centers at Stanford University, the University of Michigan, and the University of Wisconsin. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kathryn Edin.
So I have to confess, I love this town, and I want to give a few shout outs to the West Side Catholic Center, where I got to tour last week, the Greater Cleveland Food Bank, an essential partner in this research, Max Back's books that kept me sane with good fiction while I lived here and did this very tough work, and to all of you for being here and being so warm and so welcoming. So I think and one more note, I'm such a Cleveland fan that I actually own and often wear the T-shirt you can get at the museum that says Cleveland is my Paris. And it is a bumper sticker on my car. So I think it's important to note that I did not go looking for this. It was in the summer of 2010 that I left Harvard for Baltimore for a summer exploring the lives of a group of young people we had been following really since the mid-1990s when they and their parents were living in high-rise public housing in the city of Baltimore. These young people were now coming of age, and we were trying to explore how the transition to adulthood looked in the other America. And I'll never forget the day that I walked into the household of Ashley. She lived in the Latrobe Homes off Madison Avenue, right in the shadow of the Baltimore prison, a hulking Victorian relic that is now soon to be torn down. The first thing I noticed about Ashley was that she was visibly depressed. She was unkempt. And in fact, as she rocked her 2-week-old infant, kind of passing that infant from shoulder to shoulder, she was having a hard time adequately supporting the baby's head. Now, as I looked around the household, I noticed that there was virtually no furniture, a trash pick couch, a table with only 3 legs, rendering it useless. It was shoved into a corner for support, 1 chair. And so Ashley sat on that chair with the baby. I sat on the floor as we talked. Now, that perch on the floor gave me a perfect vantage point into the kitchen cupboards. In Baltimore, like a lot of places, the cupboards often don't have doors. So I noticed that there was nothing in the cupboards. And as I began to query Ashley, I learned that there was nothing in the refrigerator either. Most worryingly, no baby formula. So I concluded my conversation with Ashley. But before I did, something really struck me. I had actually studied, here in Cleveland actually, welfare in the days prior to welfare reform. In fact, if you can believe this, I spent my 20s running around the country interviewing low-income single mothers about how they made ends meet, how they balanced their budgets. So I was asking people about their expenditures and their income and trying to reconcile the two. And because I spent my 20s doing that, that culminated in the book, Making Ends Meet, I have a mental calculator in my head, almost a personality tick. If you and I go out to dinner, I might be secretly thinking, I wonder how she makes ends meet. And that impulse kind of took me over as I was about to walk out the door. And I said to Ashley, tell me about your income and expenses. And this is where I learned that this household had no cash income, no earned income, no welfare coming into the house at all. So you never know when you're going to have an epiphany. And this was a moment of epiphany. Although I didn't recognize it at the time, I did have this thought that perhaps in the wake of welfare reform, because I'd quit studying the welfare poor after welfare was reformed in 1996, perhaps right under our noses, although the consensus was that welfare reform had worked, a new kind of poverty had arisen in America, a poverty so deep that we didn't even think to look for it. So I gave Ashley the $50. I invented a ruse to come back the next day. I said, Ashley, there are some questions I forgot. Can I come back tomorrow? She said, sure. And so the next day, when the research team came to her house, was when the next epiphany occurred. Ashley met us at the door. She had gone out and gotten a home perm. She actually looked terrific. She'd walked down Broadway Avenue to the local Goodwill, big shout out to Goodwill, and she'd bought a pantsuit. She was wearing that pantsuit. She had deposited the baby with her mother, and she was on her way out to look for a job, literally with a spring in her step. $50. So I wondered, in the world's most capitalist country, is there something essential about cash? Is the absence of cash, does it permeate one's life in ways that makes it difficult to get up and look for that job? And will a little bit of cash mean the difference between getting a job or not? So anyway, I tucked both of those insights into my back pocket, continued my study, and went back to my office where I was teaching at Harvard in the fall. It was entirely coincidence that fall, that H. Luke Schaefer came as a visiting professor to Harvard. He showed up in my office on Monday morning, and so I'm a bit of a data nerd, okay? So when he showed up, I knew enough about Luke. He was coming from the University of Michigan. We didn't know each other well, but I knew he was the nation's expert on a data set called the SIP. Doesn't sound sexy, but it is. The Survey of Income and Program Participation. And it was when he came into my office, I just saw 4 letters, SIPP, because I knew that the SIP was the one data set that could actually tell us whether Ashley's situation was a one-off or whether it was a trend. Now, I think Luke and I were both shocked by what we saw next. When he came back to my office with the results a week later, what we found in the SIP, and we used $2 a day as sort of an arbitrary cutoff. You have to use some cutoff. It's better not to use your own arbitrary cutoff. So we borrowed $2 a day from the World Bank, who uses it as one of its rubrics to measure poverty in the developing world. What we saw is that if we looked at families with children, the growth in $2 a day poverty was 130%, more than doubling from about 600 families with children at any given time in 1996 to 1.5 million adults with 3 million children in 2011. Now, in many ways, these numbers raise as many questions and answers, and I could spend the next hour going with you through data set after data set after data set that indicate that things on the bottom have really gotten significantly worse. I'm going to spare you those charts. Suffice it to say, there's overwhelming evidence that something has really changed over the last 15 years, last 20 years in the lives of the poor. So these numbers raised as many questions as answers. How did people end up in $2 a day poverty? What did they do to survive? And what were the consequences, especially for the kids? What would be the intergenerational price America would pay for allowing the rise in extreme poverty? So we used the SIP as our guide and found 4 places where the SIP told us we could find people in $2 a day poverty. First of all, we started in what I'd like to think of as the quintessential American city, Chicago. I know Clevelanders wouldn't agree with that, but my Chicago roots and Luke's, we did start in Chicago, kind of an average city. Then we wanted to find a city that had been a real boomtown in the time that Michael Harrington had written The Other America and Johnson had launched the War on Poverty. But it's since had hard times. So as you know, Cleveland used to be called by its business elite the greatest location in the nation. And now we're not going to say what people say about Cleveland. We know it's not true. But Cleveland has had a downturn over the last 50 years. We then wanted to find the opposite, an area that had been deeply poor, but had seen a bit of an upswing. We chose the Johnson City region in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And finally, we went to what many people say is the poorest place on earth. It's certainly the poorest place in America and has been so for many, many years, generations. We chose a string of hamlets in the Mississippi Delta. And I'll be talking about the Delta at the end of this presentation. So I'm going to focus today mostly on causes, okay? Because I want to give you a teaser. I want you to buy the book, of course, support both booksellers and this wonderful literacy cause. But the first cause is the demise of welfare. In fact, we have a chapter controversially called Welfare is Dead. And I'm going to convince you of that, or try to convince you of that, in 2 ways. First, let's look at the numbers. So as of 1994, when TANF, that's what we call our welfare system now, we used to call it AFDC. So when you hear those phrases, TANF, AFDC, you don't need to know what they stand for. It just means cash welfare, okay? So cash welfare served about 5 million adults. And if you were poor and you had children, the probability that TANF would touch your life at some point during the year and provide a safety net under your family was about 70%. So fast forward to today. Today, only about 1 million adults remain on the rolls. And the chances that TANF will even give a dime toward supporting or sustaining you if you're a parent with children is now about 2 in 10. We have 1 million adults on the rolls at any given time, as I said, but half of those adults are in California and New York, meaning that the other 500,000 are spread across our entire nation. In many places, especially in the South and in the mountain states, TANF barely exists at all. And places like Ohio are just a little lower than average, but are struggling. So if you don't believe the numbers, listen to how dead TANF is in the minds of its potential recipients. We talked to Madonna Harris in Chicago over a summer where she and her daughter were living in a string of homeless shelters. Over one weekend where they had no food and the shelter did not offer any meals. Finally, I said, Madonna, why don't you just go down and apply for cash welfare? She looked at me, as if I was an idiot and said, they just aren't giving that out anymore. Haven't you heard? Similarly, in Johnson City, Tennessee, Travis Compton, his wife Jessica, their 2 little daughters, Rachel and Blythe, are awaiting eviction. Both have lost their jobs when the foot traffic slowed after the holidays. They've been unable to get work for months. So Travis is literally standing at the window, waiting for the sheriff's deputy to appear. When Luke asks him, why don't you go down and just apply for welfare? Travis looks confused and says, what's that? Here in Cleveland, Ray McCormick is finally convinced after many, many months in a very desperate situation. Actually, Ray has spent most of her life since the age of 12 living in $2 a day poverty. She's finally convinced to go down and apply for welfare. She comes back without benefits, telling us she was told, I'm sorry, honey, there are just so many needy people. There are not enough to go around, and then she's counseled to come back next year. So news of these soft diversions, they're very hard to track. All they take is one careless caseworker, are emerging all around the country. Now, you might say to yourself, are the $2 a day poor really separated from, unmoored from the rest of society? Or are they integrated? Are they separated from the world of work or not? We followed children in the SIP, and what we learned is that over the course of a year, only 10% had an adult in their household that claimed even a penny from TANF. But strikingly, 70% of the $2 a day poor had an adult who had a formal sector job at some point during that year. And if you just look at poor children overall, 90% have a working adult in the household. So what's going on with work? And in fact, all of the people in $2 a day had rich and varied work histories, desperately wanted to work, saw themselves as workers. Well, the bad jobs of today are simply much worse than the bad jobs of 2 generations. We have unsafe working conditions, not enough hours. Not enough hours, by the way, a huge problem. It is very difficult to find full-time, full-year hours. Work hours are constantly fluctuating. Labor law violations are common. Jennifer Hernandez in Chicago finally gets a job after an 11-month job search while she's living across a string of homeless shelters. She ends up having to clean foreclosed homes in the winter in Chicago. Foreclosed homes lack heat, they lack light, and they lack water. Great story in the book about how difficult this job was, especially for an asthmatic, and how this job really caused a cycle of illness that engulfed the whole family, deepening their next spell of $2 a day poverty. But I wanted to talk especially here in Cleveland about Ray McCormick. So if you remember on 65th, there used to be a Kmart. And Ray spent many of her teenage and young adult years working at the Kmart, loving the job even though she was never able to claim full-time hours. You may remember that Super Walmart came to town. Kmart closed. So Ray decided she was determined to make her future at Super Walmart. She actually didn't choose the Stockyards location. She went down to a southern suburb because she, as she claims, there was too much drama at that store. I'm not sure what she means, but I did shop there during my time in Cleveland. It seemed like a nice place to me. In any case, she went down to the south, the suburban store. She got a job. She was determined that she was going to be named Cashier of the Month. And so her strategy was to memorize the barcodes of the most commonly purchased produce items. She would write these down as she was working at her cashier stand. She would then read them into the recording device on her phone, and as she slept, she would put the phone on continuous play. She said, quote, "My subconscious did the job." So sure enough, she was selected to be two-time cashier of the month twice in the first 6 months that she worked at the store. Then one day, the truck she shared with several extended kin. She paid in to a kitty in order to use this truck to get to the Walmart, came up empty. It turned out that a couple of other folks had driven around to run errands that weekend, and there was no gas left in the car, and no one had any money to put gas in the tank. So desperate to keep her job, she calls her manager, "Can someone give the two-time cashier of the month a ride or a loan?" Because she wasn't set to get paid for another 2 weeks. The manager told her if she couldn't bother to work on time, she should not even come in again. So perilous work, a group of people hanging on, deeply committed to being workers, thinking of themselves first and foremost as workers, but hanging on to an increasingly perilous edge of work. I want to talk briefly again about the third leg, it's sort of in the stool of causality that we find here, and this is housing instability. If you don't have a housing subsidy or own your home, you're going to be exposing your children to repeated perilous double-ups or time in a shelter. And while falling into the arms of your family can be seen as a source of support, for the $2 a day poor, it is the condition that more often than any other exposes children to what researchers now call adverse childhood experiences, including incidents of sexual, emotional, and physical abuse. Jennifer Hernandez's daughter was in such a double up when she came home one day from running errands, and Uncle Jose was molesting her 9-year-old daughter, Caitlin. She fled to a Goodwill. The Goodwill did not have a family shelter. It had a men's shelter, but workers there emptied an office and made a home for her and the children until she could figure out what to do next. Ray McCormick, who spent her adolescence in $2 a day poverty, living amongst multiple perilous double-ups, says, matter-of-factly, "I've been beat, I've been raped." So how do these families survive? I'm just going to give you a tiny taste of this. It turns out that you actually do have to have cash in the world's most advanced capitalist society. It's common to rely on private charity, but as you might notice from the comments that were made just a minute ago by the wonderful Legal Aid Society, there's just not enough to go around in many locales. And the richest places, like Boston and Chicago, tend to have the richest charitable sectors, leading to a lot of inequality. The Delta has virtually no charitable sector out of some of its biggest cities. So although the SNAP trade is very unusual, less than 1% among the just plain poor, it is ubiquitous among the $2 a day poor. And if you sell your SNAP for cash to buy your kids socks and underwear or keep the lights on, you will go hungry. You will go hungry because the program was never intended to even get you through a full month, putting a lot of pressure, by the way, on the food bank. Another very common strategy, almost ubiquitous among the $2 a day poor, is plasma sales. Jessica Compton is her family's only source of survival when she gives plasma twice a week, leaving her physically debilitated. You probably know that we have several plasma centers here in Cleveland that we spent quite a lot of time at. It turns out that America has become the OPEC of plasma. Since 2005, just 10 years, plasma sales donations in the United States have grown from 10 million to 32 million, with no signs of abatement as the recession has eased. 70% of the world's plasma now comes from the United States because no other country in the world allows people to donate plasma as often as Jennifer Compton does. But I wanted to end my presentation, and again, I've given you a taste. with a blog post that a student sent me this morning. And it tells the story of one woman's read of $2 a day, and especially the last chapter on the Mississippi Delta. I might get emotional. It's it's an incredible post. But to me, it really answered the question that you may be asking yourself right now. You know, what can I do? Now, there's a whole policy chapter at the end of the book about what the nation can do. But you may be thinking, what can I do? And I think this blog post captures some of what you might want to do if you want to get involved. So the blogger writes, I was recently catching up with a favorite professor. We got talking about projects we're working on, and he mentioned his next book was likely going to be on the distancing of elites in America and how that's undermining our country. I immediately thought of Kathryn Edin and Luke Schaefer's $2 a day, living on almost nothing in America. Edin and Schaefer chronicle the doubling of Americans living on $2 a day over the last 20 years, an unintended consequence of the Clinton-era welfare reforms. It's smart. It's heartbreaking. It'll make you care about building a better safety net and wonder why we haven't. Nowhere were the stories more heartbreaking than in Mississippi. The Mississippi chapter came late and hit hard. It centers on the experience of Tabitha, one of 13 siblings living with her mom in a 3-bedroom apartment. While in high school, a gym teacher invites Tabitha to his house on the promise of food. He then sexually assaults her. When reported to the school, the administration shrugs. The teacher keeps his job. At home, things are no better. Her mom's boyfriend is abusive. Tabitha jumps in the middle of a particularly bad fight to protect her mom. The boyfriend pulls a gun. He then forces her mom to choose. Either the daughter leaves or he does. Mom kicks Tabitha out. With nowhere to go, Tabitha calls her 6th grade teacher, Mr. Patton. Mr. Patton was the only teacher to ever come to her house. He was the first white person to call her brothers by their names rather than boy. He was the teacher who helped her get glasses. He was the one who arranged a class field trip to D.C., the first time she had left the Delta, the first time she saw an elevator. Tabitha thought he might be able to help, willing. He comes through, getting her into a boarding school in Memphis. Reading about the profound impact of this one teacher, I cried. And then I felt hopeful. It was the first time in the book that anyone had gotten the help they needed. People had filled out forms, stood in line, and waited. And luck had moved against them. One woman lost her job after 8 years because of a $10 discrepancy in her cash register drawer. Another lost her job after being 2-time cashier of the month because she once couldn't afford to get the gas to go to work after someone borrowed her car. In Tabitha's story, someone finally got a break. An outsider, Mr. Patton, came to the Delta as part of Teach for America. His impact showed up in the life outside of school, in the world outside of test scores. In following 18 families for months and years, it was the only time someone treated the poor as equal and went out of his way to help. Recently, I had dinner with a group of friends. One was a friend who had taught in the Delta. The $2 a day book came up, and I started talking about Mr. Patton. My friend whispered to me, "You know, I'm Mr. Patton." The author had changed his name to protect identities. I was floored. I started crying. It was the hard-to-control cry of being emotionally overwhelmed. It turns out that the biggest hero of any book I read last year was a friend. I pulled it together the best I could to tell the rest of the table that my hero was our friend. I didn't make it to the end of the story before I was in tears again. He doesn't like that I use the word hero. I understand it's awkward and maudlin, but I don't do it lightly. I'm nothing if not exact about words. He says, you would have done the same thing. Maybe I would have. I hope I would have. But I didn't do the first thing. I didn't choose to live and work in the place where I'd build enduring relationships with people in grinding poverty. To close the many gaps in our society, we need to close the gap on social distance. One more thing about Tabitha. You know, Tabitha was the hungriest kid I ever met. She was hungry all of the time. The food stamps got sold to pay the utility bills. $600 in food stamps went to get the $300 necessary to keep the light and heat on for a family of 13. I remember sitting with Tabitha in Clarksdale, some miles from her home, but the only place you could kind of go out and have ice cream and sit outdoors at a cafe table. And the place is called Yazoo Pass, if you've ever been in Clarksdale. It's the old Woolworths where the sit-ins happened in Clarksdale, so a very historic spot. And we were sitting outside, it was about 10 at night, we were eating ice cream. And I said, Tabitha, this is not a light moment. Tabitha, how did it feel to be so hungry? And she told me, well, actually, it feels like you want to be dead because it's peaceful being dead. So as I said, the last part of the book ends with policy recommendations. But what I want to endorse is a litmus test moving forward. And again, this is something we can all do in our daily work as we come across people who have less than we do. What was interesting about the $2 a day poor we met was that no one said they wanted more handouts. They wanted work. They wanted full-time, full-year jobs. But more than anything, they wanted dignity. They wanted to belong. They wanted to be citizens. Some even bragged, because they'd worked enough to get a tax credit and go file taxes in one year or another, about how proud they were to be taxpayers. I don't brag about being a taxpayer. So the litmus test we endorse for any policy going forward, whether it be a government reform or what goes on in the lobby of a food bank, is, does what we're doing serve to integrate the poor or separate them? Does it bring dignity or shame? Does it make citizens of our fellow Americans? Thank you.
Today we're enjoying a Friday forum. Today we're enjoying a Friday forum featuring Dr. Kathryn Edin, Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Public Health at Johns Hopkins University, and author of $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America. We're about to head into the Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, or those of you joining us via our radio broadcast, webcast, or our new live simulcast sites, the Parma Snow branch of Cuyahoga County Public Library and Lakeland Community College. The Lake County broadcast is being hosted by the Lakeland Foundation at Lakeland Community College in partnership with Leadership Lake County. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it to @TheCityClub, and our staff will try to work it into the program. We encourage you to make your questions brief and to the point. Holding the microphone today, our Director of Programming, Stephanie Jansky, and Content Associate, Teddy Eisenberg. May we have the first question, please?
Yeah, from what I understand, the first few years of welfare reform were pretty good. Now, do you think if it had followed along those lines, we would have had those problems that we're seeing today?
So it's interesting. I testified in an event in the U.S. House of Representatives yesterday, and and was asked this question. So what happened with TANF? What happened with TANF? A lot of what happened with TANF was that it's a block grant, okay? So as it turns out, block grants give states lots of flexibility, and you might expect innovation to come from block grants and flexibility. But instead what we saw with TANF was a massive race to the bottom. Currently, the federal government spends $16.5 billion sending money from the federal government to our states for their TANF programs. Right now, only $5 billion goes into the pockets of poor folk. The rest is diverted to other purposes. Some to childcare, that's not such a bad thing, but often the diversions are to plug state budget holes, things that states would already be paying for out of their own coffers, if not for that block grant. So in these cases, I like to say that welfare has become aid to the states, not to the people. And sometimes to fund goodies that governors like state college scholarship programs. So we've seen this massive diversion away from TANF. But mostly what's happening with TANF is that people are not even coming to its doors. In part, that's because of information flows. The information needed to pass on the news that TANF is out there is simply atrophied in many of our communities, but it's also due to caseworker practices and the hoops that many states make people go through in order to get benefits. So in Georgia, for example, the rolls plummeted by 70% after a new requirement that people had to actually engage in work first for a month before they could even apply for the program. Pennsylvania is now following suit. But even more profoundly is the fact that so many Americans now are firmly ensconced in the notion that they're workers and not dependents. Okay, mothers used to see a trade-off between welfare to work. When I first went out in the field, did you go to work when you had a 3-year-old? Maybe not. This is not true in America anymore. The rich, the poor, women work. And you see a strong desire to work among the would-be welfare poor. But it's more than just a desire for income. It's a desire for respect. It's a desire for belonging, because we all know that work is citizenship in America. So in some ways, you might say that people are simply too proud to approach welfare's doors.
We have a question from Twitter. Jeff would welcome your thoughts on establishing universal basic income.
So I have just I've been working with a group of scholars on an idea like that. You might imagine, for example, expanding and tweaking the child tax credit, which basically now misses the bottom third of children. You might imagine that we could wipe out $2 a day poor simply by extending those benefits to more children and making them a little more generous. Families need cash, right? So this is not a bad idea. But whenever we hear these policy options, we have to say to ourselves, does it integrate or separate the poor? So universal programs tend to integrate. Targeted programs tend to separate. So as you think about policy options, I just encourage you to keep that litmus test in mind. It's interesting how quickly we can lose that principle and how easy it is to often amend our ideas to remain in correspondence with it.
Hi, Ben Millidan with United Way of Greater Cleveland. Thank you for your talk. There seems to be a notion in this country by at least half the voting public, possibly more, that the poor does not deserve help, that they, if you give it to them, they will become dependent on it, and or they wanted to be poor in the first place, and we should let them alone. And any positive movement in the direction of helping the $2 a day poor is met with this fierce opposition based on this stigma around being poor. How do we as a country move past that? Does it take the kind of sustained campaign that gay marriage, gay rights, civil rights had, or are there other solutions? How do we get around this roadblock?
So probably the biggest myth out there is that the poor don't want to work. They're lazy, they're indolent, and if you give them something for nothing, they'll take it, and they won't behave like other Americans. We have astonishing data to suggest this is not true. So I said that I spent my 20s going around the country figuring out how welfare recipients survived. You know, welfare has never been a very good program, right? Even in the good old days, it only paid about $500 to a family of 4 with no other income. So families were never able to survive on welfare. And as we went across the country, my colleague Laura Lane and I, interviewing hundreds of single mothers, we found that they were already working, albeit under the table, because if they told their caseworkers at the time, they'd get docked $1 for every dollar they worked. So I remember people saying to me, I'd published this book with Laura, and people saying to me on the eve of welfare reform, well, if you're right, welfare reform will work. And there's a lot of skepticism, right? Because conservatives thought the poor didn't have the will to work, but liberals thought that the poor had too many barriers to work. So welfare reform happens, right? Actually, the rise in the rolls happens as soon as we institute the modern EITC. This is probably, in my view, the best thing the Clinton administration did. It passed a set of really generous tax credits to people who worked low-wage jobs full-time, full year, and ensured they wouldn't be poor. So this was passed about 3 years before welfare reform was implemented. You began to see the rolls go down. Already early evidence that if you just change the incentives, if you made work pay, you're going to see a work response, okay? But welfare reform happens, unprecedented, very strong economy, unprecedented numbers of single mothers go to work. And they have more or less stayed there, okay? So they were leaving their informal jobs behind for their formal jobs. And it's an amazing fact how work committed our poor are. So I think this is, this message needs to get out. And it's part of why I'm doing 3 or 4 talks, a week now for, this is my 8th month on the road. But the message needs to get out. I was just speaking at the Irvine Foundation in California, the folks that own the land that Stanford University now sits on. And the president said, Kathy, I'm so glad you're coming, but I don't want you to talk about your book, $2 a day, because I only want to talk about the working poor, not the generational poor. And I said, what generational poor? I mean, it's not that people, aren't trapped in grinding poverty. I live in Baltimore. I get that. But the idea that you have generations of people separated from the world of work that are somehow distinct from the working poor is just wrong. So this is the message we need to get out. People, the welfare reform, its technical name was, you can say this 5 times fast and see how you do, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. But think about that. So the first part is personal responsibility. If we look at our government data and see this deep commitment to work, this eschewing of welfare, I think we could argue that the poor have met their part of that bargain. But our nation has not met that second part, work opportunity. Any of you who work in social services know that in many places in America, even in some of its supposedly tight labor markets, it can be brutally hard for a high school graduate to get a full-time, full-year job. At my local Safeway down the street, they only hire you for 15 hours a week, if you're a high school graduate. If you take another job and they have to schedule around you, they reduce your hours to 5. And these kind of practices, employers aren't ill-willed. I think they're just not realizing what the amazing technology they now have at their command to precisely peg labor demand, labor supply to customer demand are taking a real toll on people. We saw this publicly with the case of the Starbucks worker that made the New York Times. But more and more employers, I think, are starting to think about these practices. They're starting to realize that poverty may be bad for business. We need to have some Americans who make enough money to buy stuff in our stores. So I'll end my comment there and welcome the next question.
My name is Melissa, and on behalf of the Lakeland Foundation, we thank you for being here today. As someone entering the field, what advice do you have for the helping profession?
So the helping profession can be really tough, right? You know, Michael Lipsky wrote a very famous book years ago, published by the Russell Sage Foundation, called Street Level Bureaucracy. And what it described is the lives of people who work direct service, everything from people at food banks to police officers, who are kind of on the front lines of representing our democracy to the poor. And the central dilemma that these folks faced is there was always a sea of need, it's sort of an overwhelming sea of need. And, you know, if you're at any kind of nonprofit, you know that the resources you have to meet that need are just so inadequate, right? So the way that many frontline workers were coping, and still do, frankly, is to sort of engage in the following narrative. You know, basically, there must be something wrong with the client. And so he found this to be pervasive, you know, not among everybody. People do escape this, but it's an instinct. I even feel it. You know, I am now a year and a half further along in my relationship with Ray McCormick, and I keep thinking to myself, when is it going to get better? My impulse is to blame Ray McCormick because I'm overwhelmed by her situation. So first thing to do is read that book, okay? And don't do it. Second, you know, one-on-one relationships are really important. You know, finding ways to really forge long-term relationships with people is vital. Personal relationships with the people we serve. And, you know, I think we tend to underestimate our impact, right? You don't know if if you serve somebody at the West Side Center, you know, with kindness and dignity, you just don't know how that story is going to end. You know, one person we didn't write about in the book is just an astonishing woman, Mary Washington in Chicago. She only had one 18-year-old living with her at the time that we interviewed her. But I had actually, you know, I recruited her in Chicago and we talked and I realized that I'd actually met her 20 years prior. So she'd been a young Navy wife and they had been on the base, and when her husband was discharged, they placed the family in Altgeld Gardens, which is a public housing project where Barack Obama was an organizer. So the husband was away all day working, and she was home all day with 4 young children. And she began to become depressed. And, you know, this was in the 80s, right? She became addicted to crack cocaine. So pretty soon she was prostituting herself for the drug. She had left her family behind with her husband, and she was on the north side of Chicago in what is colloquially named the Juneway Jungle, as a prostitute, which is where I met her while I was volunteering at a homeless shelter. And in fact, it just so happens that I also knew her kids because they'd been taken in by a family that belonged to my church. Beautiful, beautiful girls. So, you know, 20 years later, I meet this amazing woman, right? Turns out that some folks from my church, we had moved to another city, had gotten her into a treatment program, and it actually worked. She got her life together. She got her certificate to be a drug and alcohol counselor, and now she was helping new folks get free from the grip of addiction. She had reclaimed her family. Her daughters are just beautiful young women. And you would never know, right? You'd never know that she'd had that period of, you know, over a decade in her life where she lived on the streets. So you never know how somebody's story is going to end, and you never know how your one-on-one impact is going to help. The third thing I would say, though, is advocate. Pay attention to what's going on in your city and in your state. Ask the hard questions of the folks that are given the responsibility of aiding our poor. You know, be involved in the political process. I think there's great meaning to that. And now that I've sort of been hanging out in Washington for the last 9 months very intently, it's amazing how citizen voice really does matter. And so that would be the third thing I would say to you is be an advocate, but be a friend.
Hi, Dr. Edin. Thank you for the thought-provoking conversation. Stephen Lake with the Cleveland Transformation Alliance. So I had a question about just poverty in general. And I just recently read an article this morning about how we often look at poverty in a very singular fashion. And in many respects, it's very multidimensional. So we can be impoverished with respect to education, with respect to housing, with respect to healthcare. And so you had mentioned the conversation you had with somebody about the infusion of $50 and how maybe that might help them kind of make that next step. So my question is can we really solve that by focusing on one, or do we really need to hit it from all the different dimensions to make a true impact?
There is low-hanging fruit. Now, we all know that if we see someone in trouble, that result is usually completely overdetermined. If we try to solve a social problem and we fix the housing piece, there are 5 other things that are going on with this family that also predict the negative outcome. So it can be frustrating when you don't take a multi-sectorial approach. But nonetheless, my recent research suggests that there are some very simple things we can do that could make a very big difference. So you want to sort of think big, but also not neglect the low-hanging fruit. So 2 examples are we are building a pretty dramatic database that actually a little bit of cash can make a difference, especially for young children and child development. Again, the state-of-the-art study that would really nail down, this connection is sort of still in its planning phases, but there is a huge weight of evidence suggesting that transferring cash to parents when their children, especially are very young, can make a very big difference. So, advocating for things like an expanded child tax credit could really be important. And advocating against the food stamp block grant could be really important. So I just want to say one word about the block grant. I'm not meaning to be ideological here, but rolling food stamps and other programs into a block grant will effectively end children's entitlement to food. And if you have a demonstration to figure out what works, you risk experimenting on whether kids have food and shelter or not. So be wise. Some of these things are really a bad idea. The other low-hanging fruit is segregation. I know we don't like to talk about segregation. We are the most segregated society we have ever been. We've been segregated by race for too long. But we are increasingly becoming segregated by income in our neighborhoods. Now, I'm an author, a lowly third author of a book coming out next week on how these kids in Baltimore turned out, the kids I was telling you about at the beginning. And so what happened to these kids, right, is they're all living in these high-rise public housing towers. If you've seen David Simon's The Wire, those are the towers. And through various means, different policy initiatives in Baltimore, they end up leaving the towers. Some get a special voucher to move them to a low-poverty neighborhood, but they don't stay there for very long. Others just witness the demolition of their projects because all those towers are now down, and they get a voucher, and they move to sort of an average Baltimore neighborhood. So an average Baltimore neighborhood still has a poverty rate, of like Cleveland, of about 30%. So we're not talking about moving them to Shaker Heights or Beechwood or Rocky River. We're talking about, kind of an average neighborhood, but not a high-rise public housing tower where the poverty rates are 60%. So after following these kids for 17 to 19 years, we are shocked. We were worried that we couldn't get the book published because the kids were looking so good. What moving them to an average neighborhood did is it dramatically reduced their exposure to violence and increased their exposure to things like working neighbors, two-parent families, professionals in the neighborhood, people with college degrees. So what we see among these kids is this enormous intergenerational leap forward. Their parents were graduating from high school at 13%. They're graduating from high school at rates of 70%. Virtually none of their parents attempted college. 70% of high school graduates are attempting post-secondary higher education. Only 18%, have ever gotten involved in the street, in illegal activity. Most are dedicated to conventional goals. They want to be police officers. They want to be accountants. So there are a lot of traps in the post-secondary marketplace that we've really got to deal with. They're scary and they're exploitative. But reducing segregation is low-hanging fruit. And it's a good thought to leave you with.
Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a Friday forum featuring Dr. Kathryn Edin, Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Public Health at Johns Hopkins University, and author of $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America. Dr. Edin appears as part of our Resilient Families series sponsored by the William J. and Dorothy K. O'Neill Foundation and the St. Luke's Foundation in partnership with Goodwill Industries of Greater Cleveland and East Central Ohio. Our hospitality partner is the Metropolitan at the 9 Hotel. Today's forum is also the Thomas L. E. Blum Memorial Forum on Overlooked Citizens of the Inner City, made possible by a generous gift from the Blum Foundation. We thank the foundation for their support. Special thanks today to our table sponsors, Cleveland Leadership Center, Cleveland Transformation Alliance, the Greater Cleveland Food Bank, Lutheran Metropolitan Ministry, Policy Matters Ohio, the Center for Community Solutions, the Centers for Families and Children, the Lakeland Foundation, and the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. Student participation from St. Martin de Porres High School was made possible by a generous grant from the David Jeffrey Epstein Memorial Fund. We thank you for your support. Sales of Dr. Edin's book, $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America, is provided by a cultural exchange. That brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you so much, Dr. Edin. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream is made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.